presently run Revelator. Can you give us a 30-second before we deep dive into your background, what in the world Revelator is?
Sounds good. Yes, so I started the company close to about a decade ago, coming from running a record label and understanding the shift and the digital transformation of the music business from a B2B perspective, from a label's perspective. And, back then, 10 years ago, we didn't have hardly any, software or tools for running a label, managing digital IP, managing reporting and royalty obligations to rights holders. So I built the platform initially to help my business transform into a digital business, and soon realized that there was everybody's pain point and problem around, data and royalties and payments and analytics and understanding more transparency around, streaming data, those kind of things. So Revelator became a B2B platform that serves, distributors, record labels, publishers, artist management companies who serve artists, who serve rights owners. And over the last... So
you probably, if you're an artist listening to this, you probably want to nudge your small label to say, are you using Revelator? But I want to get to the 10 years, but I'm going to drag you backwards in time. Because again, you're a fabulous ethnomusicology person from UCLA, but you were born in France, right? How did you, when you were a kid person, were you a musician? Were you a entrepreneur who was selling lemonade to your friends? What was that person who was maybe, you were not, so what were you doing when you were in high school? What was kind of the heartbeat of this that got started?
Even before high school, right? I grew up playing drums at the age of 9, listening to a lot of, music from around the world. My parents are from Tunisia. I was born in France, and we grew up in Los Angeles. So listening to, Brazilian music or reggae or, Arabic music or, soul was, what we would normally listen to at home. It wasn't very, top 40 radio. It was, Brazilian bossa nova and things like that. So growing up, I was exposed to a lot of music from around the world. So I think culturally, I was already, very much interested in discovering music from around the world, not just in my country, right? And that gave me already a perspective on life, a perspective on culture, a perspective on music, because I was seeking, interesting rhythms from, African music and Cuban music and Latin music. And I just loved, flamenco music. I love culture and I love music. Ethnomusicology is exactly that. It's the anthropology of music through culture, in a way. So growing up,
were your parents musicians? Because I must admit, my family, we had, over-the-air radio and a few albums, and definitely wouldn't have had this exposure as a young person. Were your parents highly musical?
Not highly musical, but they love music, and even listening to Bob Marley when you're 9 years old, that's a really great exposure, But I think once I moved to LA with my parents, and initially we came for a summer vacation, and my mom just did not want to go back to Paris. After going to Yosemite and, seeing Los Angeles, this is in the late 70s, so not a lot of traffic, a lot of great space. And it was a fantastic life to live, the Sunshine State in many ways, compared to LA, Paris, where, it's cold and it's gray and it's, not a great place to grow up in some ways as a young person. The opportunity, I saw, I started playing keyboards and synthesizers. I was into electronic music. This is the early 80s. So I was very much interested in the clash of culture and technology. And when I turned 18, I kind of stopped being in bands and playing. And I just didn't know that I wanted to be a recording or performing artist. That was not my calling. But I knew that I loved music and I loved, culture, and I had to figure out the path forward. So, I lived in Ojai for a while, and I came across an album by Ali Jihad Rassi, who was a professor at the UCLA Ethnomusicology program. And I said to myself, this is what I want to do. I want to listen to oud. I want to listen to Arabic music. I want to play the santur and, learn about the Iranian, Persian classical music and things like that. So I applied, I got in, and that was the beginning of my, education in ethnomusicology. But it was so academic, and there was a disconnect for me between the world of academia and what was actually going on in world music in the 80s. So I wanted to be doing applied ethnomusicology. So I started DJing, and I started bringing, African music and Arabic music and dance music and French hip hop in the late 80s, to clubs in LA. And I became a DJ. And from there, I became a radio host on KCRW. And, I loved the whole 90s. There was a lot of great music coming from around the world, from the UK, from Germany, from Austria. So I was really good at spotting talent and developing, an ear for music and saying, "Oh, these two tracks go really well together. Let me put it on my show." And and I started discovering artists and broadcasting and promoting them, and that kind of became the incubation of my record label, in a way, because a lot of this music just did not have distribution in the early 90s. So I would, call the artist and license the rights to use the music, and I learned about the music industry that way, because out of my passion for putting music together in compilations. Today we call them playlists, but back then we called them compilations of records, right? And we would put different songs on a CD, and that became a compilation. So
But you
that's
didn't
how I
have
got into the music industry.
but you didn't have a business background. So was this kind of a trial and error learning how to manage a label, or did you find people that were then some of that wisdom for you?
It was purely my passion to understand that I want to promote this music. So I had to learn how to license music and license the rights to music and do contracts. And, back in 1993, I had purchased a Mac computer with a stereo digital sound card, and I taught myself, digital audio editing and mastering, and I was making records. So back in 1993, after I released my first record, I had a chance meeting with a guy named Chris Blackwell, who's the founder of Island Records, producer of Bob Marley and many, many others for over 60 years. And he came to my studio in Westwood, and he saw that I was a mad scientist. I had a record, I had basically a record company in my living room. There was a computer in the middle of the living room and records on the floor all around me. And that was my passion. That was what I did, just make records. So he said, let's sign you as a label. You can probably make records a lot cheaper than I can. A U2 record costs a lot more money than what you can do in your living room. And that was kind of the beginning of digital music in a way.
So before that, were you making a full living doing this, or was this part of a portfolio of things that put food on the table?
So, after, university, I would DJ, and I was earning $60 a night DJing for a whole night, right? By the end of my career DJing, which was around 2000, I could make $5,000 a night. So that was a big difference in a decade. But when you start, you don't really think about the money. You're not doing it for the money. But you could, DJ 3-4 nights a week and make, $1,000 a month doing that. So by itself, it was not enough. But that plus the record label, was enough to live on. And, when you're in your early 20s, you don't have a lot of needs in the same way as you do when you get older. So it was a great time in my life. I really enjoyed traveling, going record shopping. If you remember Rhino Records and Aaron's Records, sometimes you would go and find, the one vinyl that was available in Los Angeles, and I was one of the few DJs that had that record, and I would play that on my radio show and at clubs. And, there was a special relationship to music as culture, especially in physical format like vinyl. And, I miss that a lot today in digital music.
So I was going to say, those of you who are listening to this on YouTube are going to see your face light up. But those who are listening for the audio only, you're missing Bruno's face totally light up when he's talking about this time period. You have this joy on your face talking about this. So then you went and were part of someone else's label, but with your own sub-label brand continuing, correct?
So Island Records was our distributor, but it was our label distributed by Island Records, and then Universal purchased Polygram, and then I continued my work with Chris Blackwell directly through his new label called Palm Pictures, and then, started becoming an independent label in the, early 2000s, and I've been independent ever since. I don't release as much music today, or as I did last decade, but I think ultimately my interest started shifting to figuring out how to use technology to streamline the complexities of running a record label. And the challenge I saw, in 2003, I already had to deal with Apple. So I was already, selling on iTunes and dealing with digital, learning about the complexities and challenges of digital around metadata and reporting and, data processing, really. And the challenge I started seeing in the market was when Spotify came out in 2007, 2008. And until then, downloads were a great business. And, we were able to, have 8 people in the company. So when you're running a small label with 8 people, it's pretty meaningful. You're able to release music, promote music, market music. And, there was a good business. We were doing a lot of sync licensing, on film and television and advertising. And we had kind of found a market for this lifestyle niche, boutique label. But when I saw the rise of streaming, I said to myself, oh, we're going to be in trouble. It's going to cannibalize downloads, and the unit economics on streaming are just not the same.
That's a polite way to put it.
I'm trying not to use bad words.
Well, for those of you who this may not be your jam, the revenue per unit was low, and the detail and hassle per unit didn't necessarily change, right? So that you were having data coming in for penny fractions, that you used to be dealing with much larger units and having lower volume but still data per item. So that kind of adds to the complexity of the thing.
Yeah, you go from, getting 70 cents per download or $7 per download to getting 0.0035 cents per stream, and your file now has, a million lines in a CSV. Sure.
We'll swing back in the conversation, but let me sort of take you a slightly different direction. You also, before you go too deep into the current great work you're doing, you also became more of a lifestyle curator too, right? So whether that was working with Cirque du Soleil or working with a hotel chain, you were taking an avenue of bringing music to place. How did that, I shouldn't say it's a left turn, because to me it aligns wonderfully with your label, but how did you get into the place-based music? And then why are you not still in place-based music?
When I was running their label, in let's say it's 2004, I mean, even before, right? In the mid-90s, I started, creating compilation records. And those records were a lot of great world music. And Chris Blackwell had a chain of hotels across Miami, Bahamas, and Jamaica called Island Outpost. And he asked me, hey, can you create, the soundtrack of the hotel experience with your records? So I would start traveling to, these locations and start to learn about the vibe and what the feel of those places are, and then kind of put together soundtracks and playlists and collections of music that would really capture the space. And that was an amazing time in my life because I got to travel a lot and really try to create this sonic architecture to the brand and really understand what does, Goldeneye in Jamaica sound like? What does, Eleuthera in the Bahamas, there's a place called Pink Sands, which is a beautiful beach and property. It's like, what does that sound like? Because they're different. Every property has its own vibe. I was collecting a lot of music. I was, curating a lot of music for these properties and making records as part of that and selling records, in the mini bars, right? This is going 20, 30 years back. And that's how, people discovered music and listened to music during their holiday, and that became the soundtrack to their vacation. So I really loved connecting this lifestyle experience around music and helping people explore and discover new music through that, through that distribution, which is more lifestyle distribution. When it got to LA, places like Oliver Peoples, which is a great, eyewear company, they were the first ones to start selling our records in their shops. This is going back to 1995. And then, we started doing compilation records for American Rag on La Brea, and doing records for yoga studios and things like that. So we were always looking for new ways to distribute music and share music that would just never, make it on commercial radio. And I think lifestyle distribution was really interesting.
And I think for a lot of people, I wanted to make sure that you talked about that because a lot of people don't realize that entire space occurs. And I keep running into people who currently do this, and I'm always fabulously baffled that this is an area of expertise, but it's a unique branded element that is the sonic architecture of a place, which I do find a really interesting business model that is much more lucrative at times than some of these other things that we're currently dealing with. So, but let me sort of bring you back to both what you're doing now, but maybe how in the world. So you traveled a lot, and then you've decided to move your family to Israel, and so you now are running this business that you've been incubating for 10 years, but from Israel, which is why we're talking in the evening your time. So, how is it to be running this? How is it to be growing this? And how do you deal with this as an international company?
Sure. So initially in the early days, up until about 2015, it was really me building the core software infrastructure, layer and application layer so that I could run my business and I could start distributing other people and understanding how to bring more efficiency around the business of music. Then when we went to market in 2015, we found interest and demand for our products, specifically around analytics, because everyone did not have good visibility into streaming data. But while analytics are an important part and data is an important part of today's way of doing business, I think the most interesting part for me was following the money. How do we, understand how to do royalty payments faster? How do we get people paid faster? How do we accelerate payments for rights owners? And I think that's kind of been the thesis that I've been going under for the last 5, 6, 7 years of trying to really understand how to accelerate the flow of funds to all the rights owners that are involved in a song and an intellectual property into a recording or composition.
So you've already talked about that you started as a drummer and enjoying music and weren't the tech guy. So, but you taught yourself how to be using the early Apple computer. Are you now the tech guy? How did you become the tech guy? Do you have a battalion of tech people that make you the tech guy? Because for a lot of people, there's a tech underbelly underneath what they did, or they were, taking apart appliances in their parents' home, or something. How have you become the tech guy?
So, I remember going back, to the mid '90s. There were no databases back then for us to easily manage metadata. So I had to keep track of credits on all the records I was licensing and producing using FileMaker Pro. And I was, building FileMaker Pro databases so I could keep track of who we need, who the credits for those songs and who we needed to pay. Fast forward to 2003, 2004, the beginning of cloud, I started looking at, can I use Salesforce as a CRM for managing all the metadata for my label, and started kind of learning about how to use, cloud-based software for, creating relational objects, relational databases. So we could have a database called tracks, a database called releases, a database called artists, and just kind of creating a way of mapping all this information that our label needs to keep track of, and be able to create this, CRM automation around marketing. And, going back to 2004, we were already doing, SEO optimization for landing pages when somebody would come to look for Google and say, what was that song in Grey's Anatomy, we were one of the top ranking pages because we were creating landing pages for every time we had a license on film or TV with all the keywords that were relevant to the Google search engine. And then we were able to capture a lot of emails and help our artists grow their audiences and then automate the process of, say, discover this artist on these iTunes, store links and things like that. But when I got to Israel, obviously I wasn't going to sell a product based around Salesforce, but I had kind of built the prototype early in, a decade before, just to basically understand how to manage a record label's metadata and the data structure and the schema of the data, and all the metadata fields and all the things you needed to know to just keep track of all the data. And I think that just kind of became the foundation for me saying, okay, I need to build better tooling, better software if I'm going to continue to run my label, because I don't want to have 10 more people. It's too expensive to employ. And I just didn't believe that the amount of subscribers in the streaming era would be growing fast enough to offset the loss of revenue from downloads. So there was this, middle period where after 2009 till about 2014, I just didn't see a big business in running a label, and it was still too much risk, considering that streaming was an exciting new opportunity, but the size and the volume of streaming was just not yet warranting the risk in running the label. And from the moment I started developing the tooling, I obviously had already the experience in understanding metadata structure and rights information and contracts, data models and those kind of things. So it was actually pretty easy for me. It was actually me applying myself in a V2 kind of way. I did it before. It was my own pet project, but now it needed to be a product that other people could use. So I had to kind of create some type of standards around metadata for how do you describe rights, how do you describe release information, track level information, artist level information, those kind of things. So it kind of came naturally. And, I hired a development team, an engineering team, and, I would tell them, okay, this is what the data model is for a track, for a release, for an artist, for a DSP report, those kind of things. And I was interested because I wanted to build this product, and I think just through my interest, I became a product guy. Maybe not so much the tech guy, but I understood tech enough to know what I needed to do to get the product to look and feel, and be user friendly. And what I realized along the way is, you learn about back-end development, you learn about front-end development, but I loved good product, and I cared a lot about user experience and usability. And I was always frustrated with products that did not meet my expectations or were just not intuitive. So I really put a lot of effort into developing intuitive product that deals with a lot of complexity in music data and metadata. And I think, the first iteration of that product, we designed 3 different times before I was comfortable releasing it. And that was 2014, 2015. And that product lasted, 7 years. And now we've completely rebuilt the front-end application as we've had to learn how to scale, our operations around the world. So today, I'm proud to say the team's done an incredible job at, creating a web application that's responsive, that can scale down all the way to a mobile phone, for artists and labels in Africa who don't have, desktops necessarily, who are using, uploading music from a mobile device, to, distributors in Indonesia and Hong Kong who use it in Chinese or who care about the Taiwanese market, and the platform localizes to 25 languages. It's, Arabic and Hebrew right to left. These are not easy things to do.
These are not small things.
Yeah. Once you've done it and you've learned the mistakes that you should have done differently, the next time you get the opportunity, you want to do things correctly. And I think we've done a really good job now, at doing that.
So let me point to current and forward. So looking on your website, I was kind of tickled when you look at your products, you've got a category for Web 2 products, which implies then that there's Web 3 products in the pipeline, and also that you've got the ability to be offering business intelligence tools to go with all of this. Can you talk a little bit about without giving away company secrets, the sort of forward direction and where you're inspired to take this group of B2B clients and tool sets and people all over the world? What's the Web3 side of this? And then what are you thinking and doing and offering with the business intelligence side of this?
Sure. So, streaming business models provides two data sets. Financial data, which comes monthly, and consumption data, which comes daily. So for the majority of artists and labels and distributors, the need to understand the daily consumption, the usage pattern of where your songs are streaming across which markets and platforms is important to helping inform marketing decisions and be able to understand, is my single really taking off in a certain market or things like that. And it really becomes a data infrastructure problem because there's so much data. When you're processing 3 billion streams per month or more, or 6 billion streams, or some of our companies are doing about 80 to 200 million streams a month individually. And it becomes a challenge to deal with that amount of data coming from many different sources, different platforms, Spotify, Apple, Deezer, YouTube, etc., TikTok. And the volume of data is just unmanageable for most companies. So streamlining all those, automating the whole process of collecting, aggregating, normalizing, ingesting, deduplicating, matching, all the things you have to do so that you could just look at a dashboard and understand what's going on. And your artists can understand where they're performing or not. Yeah, I think what's interesting with that is if you can, accelerate the pace at which people get information about the performance of their assets, it becomes really interesting in not just for marketing purposes or financial management and understanding how to run a business and how to make investment decisions into your artists, how to provide advances to those artists, but also part of what excites me now is around automating the whole valuation of catalogs so that any of our customers can understand the value of their work in real time. Because what I found is that it's really hard to gather all the data, share all the data with potential buyers or lenders or people who want to finance, buying assets or catalog. So a lot of what drives me is, can I accelerate payments and can I automate the understanding for the rights owner, even if it's for your 33% share of the song? Do you know the value of that song? Is there a way that you can understand how much your 1/3 of that song is worth? And can you access, a market where you can offer fractional ownership of that? Or can you sell or list those royalty streams to potential buyers? And I think that's where the market's going.
Or I would think if you could also subdivide your portfolio too, right? So someone can see before they are buying some kind of a representation of the financial elements, and that you could also take that sub-database and be able to move it to a new owner or a new investor. I would think would be one of the options here.
Absolutely. And the whole idea of creating baskets of songs that comes with their cash flows and their valuation metrics, and making that more of a seamless user experience so that you can accelerate underwriting and then you can share that information with potential interested party will allow independents to easily, more easily sell or fractionalize their catalog and get financed or get funded or access working capital. And I think the majors, have whole teams, analyzing catalog, purchasing, Neil Young and Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen for $500 million. But the independents just don't have those tools, nor do they have those opportunities. And I believe that what we'll see over the next 5 years is the growth of the independents will continue. And as a result, the growth of financial services for funding independents will continue. And the better the tools the independents have, then the more likely they'll be able to understand that they also have opportunity for liquidity and for exits.
So my last question is then a future direction, which is kind of the Web3 side of the house as to sort of rethinking the connective tissue. I'm assuming that's some of your heartbeat going forward. And how are you looking at Web3 opportunities? And is there anything you can share with us that you were tinkering with this in this regard?
Sure. So we've been developing, Web3 infrastructure for 4 years, initially around a digital wallet for creators where they could manage their rights and their royalty flows and payments. We've connected, streaming royalty data from the Revelator platform to those wallets so that any rights holder would receive their share of the money flow and could even request advances against their future cash flows based on the consumption data. So we've done that. The interesting part that I'm seeing now, obviously the music industry is interested in NFTs, they're interested in digital collectibles. And when I look at the Web3 space, I look at three different types of marketplace opportunities. I look at digital collectibles, I look at licensing into Web3 and metaverse or gaming applications. And the third part is around the securitization or the digital securities, selling IP or fractional IP to marketplaces that are compliant and regulated and that can offer tokenized securities for music IP. And I think, when we look at the next 5 years, the streaming landscape will look a little different because I think there will be new marketplaces, new types of marketplaces that open up, more direct to fan and tokenized economies around communities and fan-powered communities that will go beyond just what artists are able to do today, which is earn money from streaming. I think the streaming income will just be an input into the value of IP that can be monetized through a digital asset across, different types of marketplaces, whether it's a collectible or licensing your song into, the Decentraland or the Sandbox or other types of Web3 properties.
I was going to say, or maybe places where people are actually going, but that's a whole nother. We're recording this in October of 2022 when people are kind of going, how many people actually are showing up in these spaces? You actually could have a music data side of this that could help validate that as well.
Completely. So I do, love the infrastructure of Web3. I think we're moving from a, Web 2 internet, which was based around the flow of information. It was an information-based internet, and I think now we're moving into a value-based internet where value gets exchanged between parties. And I think we'll provide a lot more interesting opportunities around engagement, around direct fans and, direct to fan and direct to collector and community building. And I think that's really exciting.
Well, Bruno, we've been talking for a while. It's been great talking. Is there anything we have not talked about that you'd like to cover before we wrap up?
I don't know. I think I'm just, the only thing I could add to what I said earlier is I've never been more excited about the music industry. And I've experienced, different phases of it. I've experienced the analog world. I've, the 80s and the 90s. I've experienced the digital, 2000, 2010s. And now I'm experiencing it again for the third time in a way, which is a shift in the business model and the distribution channels. And it's the most exciting time I've seen, in my whole career. So, while it may seem cryptic and complex and people associate, blockchain with cryptocurrencies, it is the underlying or the underpinning technology, but it's so much more than that. And I think that I'm really looking forward to seeing how this technology becomes adopted and becomes used for the next 5 to 10 years and how it creates more democratization of access to music IP and allows, more creators to make a living from their art.
So if people are also excited about this and would like to reach out to you to connect with you and your company, how would you like them to reach out and who would you like to reach out?
So I think Revelator.com is a good place to start. You can contact us from the website. And if you're, interested in music IP, whether it's from the seller side or the buyer side, or if you're a record label that's looking for better tools to help you understand the value of your work and monetize your IP, or a distributor looking to launch a service and create a DIY self-distribution model, I think we're a great company to work with.
Thank you so much for joining us, Bruno. Have a good evening as you're already deep into your evening, and appreciate this great conversation.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks, Gigi.